A woman spent years mapping the caves beneath the Appalachian Mountains, not as a scientist with funding or a university behind her. Alone, with hand-drawn charts and collected mineral samples and sketches of things she had no name for. Pale things, tall things, things that didn't need eyes, because they had learned to read the dark in a language older than sight. She hid everything she found. Then she disappeared. Then the FBI came and locked the door. By the time this story is over, you'll understand why the government's silence about what lives beneath these mountains is more disturbing than any single encounter inside them. And you'll understand why one family has spent 30 years being told the wrong story about a woman who was braver than anyone gave her credit for. If you found a hidden map inside your dead mother's locked cabin, a map that led underground, would you follow it? There is a number that tends to silence people when they hear it for the first time. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, the longest documented cave system on the planet, stretches for approximately 426 mapped miles underground. That sounds enormous until you learn what the word mapped is actually doing in that sentence. Because mapped means surveyed, measured, named. It does not mean complete. It does not mean understood. And in the context of the Appalachian Karst system, the vast limestone network that runs beneath one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, mapped miles represent something closer to a guess than a fact. The Appalachians themselves are ancient in a way that makes the word ancient feel inadequate. These mountains were forming when the continents were still assembled into a single landmass. What runs beneath them is not a scattering of isolated caverns. It is a continuous, interconnected labyrinth carved by slightly acidic groundwater dissolving limestone over hundreds of millions of years, leaving behind tunnels, vertical shafts, flooded passages, and sealed chambers that have never admitted a human being, and likely never will. For every passage that has been documented, there are others that collapse without warning, flood without season, or simply narrow into voids too tight for anything larger than water to pass through. The mountains go deeper than anyone has ever measured. What that means practically, for explorers, for researchers, for anyone trying to understand what this landscape actually contains, is that the darkness down there is not a temporary condition you move through with a flashlight. It is the permanent state of a system that predates human life on this continent by an almost incomprehensible margin. If something had spent enough generations adapting to that environment, it would not look like anything we have a name for. And it would have had a very long time to learn that the surface world He was 12, maybe 13, new to West Virginia, new to the mountains, new to the particular social economy of being the kid who has something to prove. The group he had attached himself to had a ritual, a rough, unspoken one, the kind that teenage boys construct when they need a measure of courage that doesn't require anyone to say the word out loud. You went deeper into the mountains, and the deepest test, the one that separated the ones who could handle it from the ones who couldn't, was the caves. There was a boy named Caleb leading this particular expedition. Caleb was the kind of person who took things one step further, not because he was fearless, but because he needed other people to believe he was. That distinction matters, Because when the two of them stepped through the cave entrance just after midnight, after the sleeping pills had pulled the parents under, after the bedroom window had been eased open and closed again quietly, what they found inside wasn't what either of them had been performing courage for.
The flashlight beams didn't behave correctly. In open darkness, a flashlight spreads. The beam fans out and gives you a rough picture of the space around you. Inside this cave, it did the opposite. The light seemed to compress, to pull inward, to illuminate only a narrow channel of wet stone directly ahead, before simply stopping. Not fading, stopping. As if the darkness had a density that light couldn't negotiate with. The dark in there had weight. They heard something move in a branching passage to their right. Both of them, without any coordination, switched off their flashlights simultaneously. An instinct neither of them could explain. And then a voice came out of the dark. Rough, strained, like sound being dragged through gravel. And it said, "Turning off the flashlight won't help. I see you better in the dark." They ran. They did not stop running until they were back at his bedroom window. They never spoke about it to anyone from that circle. They have never spoken about it to each other since. What is the simplest explanation for a voice in the dark that says, "I see you better in the dark"? A person. Someone living in those caves. A drifter. Someone hiding from something. Someone who had decided the underground was preferable to the surface. It happens. The Appalachian cave systems have a documented history of being used as shelter by people operating outside of ordinary society. Drug operations ran out of them for decades. Fugitives have used them. In a region with persistent poverty and a geography that naturally resists law enforcement, the caves were a practical option for anyone who needed to disappear. That is the rational answer. Both boys settled on it eventually. It was the only version of the story that let them sleep. But there is a problem with that explanation, and it is not a supernatural one. It is acoustic. Sound in caves does not behave the way it does in open air. It bends. It travels through stone and water and air pockets simultaneously, arriving at your ears from directions that make no physical sense. A voice heard in one passage may have originated from a chamber hundreds of feet away. The roughness, the strange quality, the sense that it was scraping its way out of the air, that could be distortion. That could be distance and geology working together in an unfamiliar way.
What it could not explain was the timing. The voice came immediately after the flashlights went off, not after a delay suggesting someone had heard them and responded. Immediately, as if whatever was in that passage had been tracking them before the lights went out and wanted them to know it. That detail, small and almost too simple to focus on, is the one that has stayed with him for the rest of his life. He still keeps a light on when he sleeps.
"3 years ago, a biologist bought a cabin in the mountains of North Carolina. Not a vacation property, a working base. He had spent years studying troglodytic organisms, creatures that have adapted over generations to survive in environments of absolute darkness. And the cave concentration in this particular area of the Appalachians was, by his assessment, unlike anything else he had encountered. Many of the caves were interconnected underground, and something in the patterns of what he found inside them kept pulling him back. It started with footprints that didn't match any cataloged species. Then marks on cave walls. Not geological formations, but something more deliberate, almost like notation, though not recognizable as any known symbol system. Then animal remains near cave entrances, not deposited there by predators from outside. The species involved were outdoor animals, the kind that wouldn't enter a cave voluntarily. Something was bringing them in.
He set up trail cameras at multiple entrances. The cameras either disappeared entirely and later turned up destroyed, or they recorded nothing. And yet the signs of activity inside the caves continued to accumulate. He began to believe that whatever was using these passages had developed some awareness of observation, that it knew what a camera was for, or at least knew that the entrance was being monitored and adjusted accordingly. It wasn't hiding from him randomly. It was hiding from him specifically. He brought his dog to the cabin 9 months ago. The dog was experienced with mountain environments, used to wildlife, used to the outdoors. Within hours of arriving, it became inconsolable, growling, whimpering through the night, behaving as though it was in pain when nothing was physically wrong with it. A vet confirmed the dog was healthy. The moment it left the property,
8 people entered that cave. One morning, no particular reason to expect anything different from the mornings before it. They had already mapped the entrance section. They knew there was a fork deeper in, 2 branching passages that split off from the main channel, and they had been methodical about it, moving slowly, documenting everything, leaving light markers along the route so they could navigate back without depending entirely on their flashlights. They were standing near that fork when one of them noticed the shimmer, a faint reflective quality in a small hollow off to the side, a recess that seemed to lead deeper, a subtle sheen that could have been an unmapped mineral formation. Minerals in cave systems can carry real commercial value. It was a reasonable thing to investigate. The 2 at the front of the group moved toward it. They stepped into that section of the cave. 10 seconds later, Michael, third in line, just about to follow, heard screaming from inside. Then something grabbed his leg and pulled him downward. Not toward the passage, downward. The rest of the group grabbed him and pulled back. They got him out. They ran the full length of the mapped route to the entrance, following the light markers, practically carrying Michael between them. And they did not stop until they reached the cabin and called the police. 8 went in. 6 came out. The 2 who stepped into that hollow left no trace. No equipment, no footprints beyond the point where they entered. Investigators who went into that section afterward found nothing. Not a sign that 2 human beings had ever been there. As of the time this account was given, the case remained open and the group remained under investigation. Not as suspects exactly, but because there was no other framework available for what had happened.
Michael's injuries were documented at the hospital. What the doctors described does not fit neatly into any standard incident category. The marks on his leg showed that something had grabbed him with enough force to break skin through heavy fabric.
through his pants. The pressure applied, according to the medical assessment, was significantly beyond the range of a normal human grip. If the cause had been a large predator, a mountain lion, a black bear, anything in the documented fauna of the North Carolina mountains, the wound profile would have looked completely different. Large predators leave deep puncture patterns, tearing damage, specific claw geometry. These wounds had none of that. The impressions were shaped like a hand, not claws, a hand. But the force behind them was not consistent with human musculature operating within normal parameters. No known animal, not quite human, strength that exceeded both categories.
The shape said person. The force said something else entirely. A separate confirmation arrived later. There are no minerals in that section of the cave that reflect light in any meaningful way. Whatever produced the shimmer that drew the first two forward was not geological. Which raises the question that the narrator admits he cannot stop turning over. If it was eyes, reflective eyes at the edge of a flashlight beam, wouldn't the two who walked toward it have noticed movement? Wouldn't they have seen it as something other than a static surface? Unless it was very good at staying still. Unless it had been doing exactly that, in exactly that kind of darkness, for a very long time.
You've just heard two accounts from people who encountered something in these caves and walked away changed by it. What's coming next is the story that may actually explain both of them. A woman who spent decades studying what lives down there, who built a hidden laboratory in the mountains, and whose research the FBI decided the public had no right to see. If that doesn't make you want to stay, I don't know what will. Subscribe to Midnight Shadows so you don't miss what's still coming on this channel. And keep watching, because the next part of this story is the one that keeps me up at night.
She was born into the wrong era and the wrong marriage simultaneously. Near the Smoky Mountains, roughly 47 years before this account was given, a woman grew up in a culture that had a very specific idea of what her life was supposed to look like. She was supposed to keep the house. She was supposed to revolve around a husband. She was supposed to treat her own curiosity about biology, about geology, about the living world as a private indulgence at best, a threat to the household at worst. Her husband enforced this view with the full weight of a personality that ran on control. He was not a man who could tolerate things existing outside of his management. When she pushed against the boundaries of what he permitted her to be, the friction in the house became something their child could feel, even without understanding it. Something was wrong. Something was always wrong. When the boy was 14, she disappeared. The husband told everyone she had left, that she had chosen her own life over her family, that she was unstable, that she was someone to be dismissed. The town accepted this. The police accepted this. When the boy went to them and said he didn't believe it, they told him his mother was troubled, and that the purpose of his own life should be to manage his future wife better than his father had managed his. He was 14.
That is what they told a 14-year-old boy. He never accepted it. He carried that refusal for the next several decades, through his father's illness, through the years of caretaking a man he did not respect, through a life that had been quietly shaped around an absence no one else was willing to call what it was. Until the day he found the map hidden in the walls of his childhood home. And everything his father had spent years trying to erase turned out to still be there, waiting.
The cabin was so absorbed into the tree line that it looked like the forest had grown around it deliberately, claiming it back. It had been there long enough to settle into the landscape, long enough that his father, who had clearly known nothing of its existence, had never found it. The key was hidden in a narrow slit in the wall of the family home, alongside a letter. The letter told him she loved him. It told him that if something had happened to her, there were two possibilities. Either the answers were in the cabin, or his father was responsible. She had written it, knowing both were plausible. Inside the cabin, he found a life she had built in secret. Every book, every sample, every page of notes had come from her own effort. A woman with no formal education beyond elementary school, who had taught herself biology, geology, and systematic field documentation through sheer discipline. The cave maps she had drawn were precise enough to be mistaken for professional surveys, each tunnel traced, each chamber labeled, years of work rendered in careful, patient ink.
And then the drawings. Creatures she had sketched because she had no camera and needed to record what she was seeing. Pale to the point of near white. Tall, taller than a person. Eyes that appeared vestigial, non-functional. She believed they navigated primarily through echolocation, reading vibrations in the stone and air, the way a bat reads open space, but with a sophistication that suggested something more than instinct. She documented an unknown species, alone, in the dark. And her notes were not the notes of someone who had been frightened into silence. They were the notes of someone who believed coexistence was possible, who had begun leaving small offerings near cave entrances, and observed what she described as a measurable reduction in disturbance activity in response. She did not write about these creatures as monsters. She wrote about them as neighbors who had been there first.
They know your heartbeat.
What does it mean for a creature to be intelligent without being human? The notes she left behind don't answer that question directly. She wasn't writing a philosophical treatise. She was writing field observations. But the picture that emerges from them, read carefully, points towards something that doesn't fit the categories we usually reach for when we talk about what lives in these mountains. The creatures she documented were not predatory in the way large cave fauna typically presents. Bears use caves for hibernation. Mountain lions shelter in them opportunistically. What she was observing did not behave like either. They appeared to operate with structure, coordinated patterns of movement, consistent use of specific chambers, behaviors that suggested roles or organization rather than solitary survival. She noted that their response to human presence was not immediate aggression,
It was assessment. They would monitor, they would track, and they would act, but only under specific conditions that she came to understand as territorial rather than predatory.
The echolocation she described was sophisticated enough that she believed they could distinguish between different individuals by heartbeat and gait alone. Think about what that means practically. It means that in the absolute darkness of those caves, they would have known the difference between a person who had been there before and a person who was new. It means the voice in the branching passage, "I see you better in the dark," may not have been a threat. It may have been a statement of fact, delivered by something that simply wanted the two boys to understand the nature of the situation they had walked into. It wasn't threatening them, it was informing them. The offerings she left, food placed carefully near entrances she had identified as active, produced a response she described as consistent. Disturbance activity near the cabin reduced. The sounds she occasionally heard at night became less frequent. Whatever protocol governed their behavior towards surface dwellers, she had found the edge of it. She had learned enough to exist alongside them without triggering whatever came next.
He found what he believes was her body in his early 30s. After years of entering the caves cautiously, finding nothing, convincing himself that her notes were the product of isolation and an overactive mind, after years of telling himself the rational story, he found her in a section of the cave system not far from the cabin. The word believes is carrying a lot of weight in that sentence, and he is honest about it. The remains he found were consistent with someone who had died around the time of her disappearance. Consistent with her. But certainty in that situation, in that environment, after that many years, certainty is complicated. What was not complicated was what it meant. She had not left. She had not walked away from him. She had died in the mountains she had spent her life studying. And the man who had spent decades telling everyone she was unstable and irresponsible had known, or at minimum suspected, exactly where she was, and had said nothing.
The grief of that moment, he says, was not simple. It was not clean. There was grief in it. Of course there was grief in it. 30 years of it compressed into a single point of recognition. But there was also something else. The word he uses is certainty. She hadn't abandoned him. That had been the open wound for 3 decades. The possibility, however much he refused it, that maybe she had chosen to leave. Finding her in those caves closed that wound permanently. She never left. She never left him. He called the authorities. For 5 days, the investigation proceeded normally. They kept him informed. They treated him as someone with a right to know what was happening. And then, on the 6th day, the FBI arrived.
The FBI does not typically involve itself in missing persons cases that have already been closed for 30 years. They do not typically arrive at a remote cabin in the North Carolina mountains 5 days into a routine investigation and declare the entire site off limits. They do not typically seal a private property
remove all materials, and cut off the next of kin from any further access or information. Not for a case that on its surface involves one woman, one old disappearance, and a family dispute about what really happened.
And yet, that is exactly what occurred. Within days of finding her remains, he was shut out completely. The cabin, the research, the maps, the creature sketches, the mineral samples, the journals she had kept for years in secret. All of it became part of an ongoing federal investigation that he has no access to and receives no updates about. He hired a lawyer. He filed paperwork. He has spent money he does not have on a process that has returned nothing. The official explanation, to the extent he has received one, is that the site is part of an active investigation. That is the entirety of what he has been told. That is not a bureaucratic delay. That is a decision. Consider what the FBI would need to have found, or to have already known, to make that decision on day 5. The research his mother accumulated over decades would have to have represented something significant enough that its existence, in the hands of a private citizen with no institutional affiliation, constituted a problem. Something that federal agencies had either already documented and classified or urgently needed to control before anyone else could verify it independently.
Here is the question his mother's notes actually raise, and the one that the FBI's response has made impossible to dismiss. She believed coexistence was achievable. She spent years demonstrating it, or at least approaching it, reducing disturbance, learning the behavioral logic of what she was observing, treating what she found not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a presence to be understood. Her research, if it holds up, suggests that the creatures beneath these mountains are not inherently dangerous to humans who respect their territory. If that is true, the government's interest in suppressing this information is not about public safety. It is about something else, about the legal and jurisdictional implications of an intelligent species living in a federally managed landscape, about what it would mean for land use, for mining, for the network of caves that run beneath properties and parks and watersheds across the entire Appalachian Range, about the difference between an unknown animal and something that leaves deliberate marks on cave walls and learns to recognize individual human beings by the sound of their heartbeat.
That distinction has consequences. Legal ones, scientific ones, political ones that no federal agency wants to navigate in public. The caves aren't the secret. What they prove is. He still goes to the edge of the sealed perimeter sometimes. He doesn't try to get inside. The cabin is monitored now. He just stands there, thinking about her sitting in that lamplight, drawing what she saw, mapping what no one else had thought to map, building something extraordinary out of nothing, in secret, because a controlling man and an indifferent world had told her she wasn't supposed to. Thinking about the fact that whatever she found is still down there, still in the dark, still in all likelihood, aware that something has changed.
3 people. A teenager who heard a voice that already knew he'd switched off his light. A biologist whose trail cameras kept vanishing and whose dog couldn't survive 2 nights near the cave entrances. A man locked out of his own mother's life's work by a federal agency that arrived 5 days after he found her body and has said nothing since. None of them knew each other. None of them were looking for the same thing. And yet what they encountered traces back to the same mountains, the same passages, the same suggestion that something has been living in the Appalachian cave systems long enough to understand us far better than we understand it. The rational explanation is still available to you. Drifters, misidentified animals, a grieving son who wanted meaning from his mother's death. You can take that explanation, and it will hold together well enough. But the FBI doesn't seal cabins over drifters. Doctors don't write up injury profiles with no matching species over misidentified animals. And women who lose their minds in isolation don't produce decades of precise, methodical, internally consistent field documentation that federal agencies decide needs to be classified. If you want to keep going deeper, because there are more accounts, more caves, and more questions this channel is not done asking, make sure you're subscribed to Midnight Shadows. The next video picks up a thread from this one that I think is going to change how you understand what's been documented in these mountains. You don't want to come back to find you missed it.